Hello everyone, this is Alessandro Zomparelli, and in this video I want to give you an introduction on how to interact with Blender for the very first time. As you can see, Blender have different frames in the view, and the main one is the 3D viewport. Here we have the outliner, where you can select the individual objects, or you can see the collection that are basically the layers inside Blender. Here we have the property panel, where you can control information about rendering, the output, the word, the object, materials, texture, and all those kind of information can be controlled from here. Here we have the timeline, where you can play your animation, and the most of the things happen here in the 3D viewport. Here on the left you have the toolbar with some tools that you can use, and on the right you have some widgets that you can use for navigating inside the viewport. For example, you can zoom from here, you can pan the view from here, you can go to the camera view, or you can change between perspective and orthographic view. This widget here is used for rotating the camera around your object, or to go to the main views in order to see your object in orthographic view in the main projection views. You can of course navigate with the mouse, so if you press the middle button you can orbit around your scene, or if you hold Shift key and you press the middle button of the mouse you can translate the view, or if you scroll the wheel you can zoom in and out. You can also zoom smoothly just holding Control and the middle button of the mouse. Let's see what are the main tools that we have here. First, we have different selection mode. By default it uses the select box, or you can use, for example, the tweak that basically allows you to pick and move object in your scene. You have also the move tools, so if you have an object that is selected you can use the arrow in order to move your object in the scene. You can move in the main direction, or you can move in the main planes. We have the rotate tool that allows you to rotate around the different axes. The three different colors usually represent the X, Y, and Z. R, G, and B are X, Y, and Z. Similar thing for the scale of the object. So you can scale in the different direction, or if you use the white handle, you can scale it uniformly. We have also the transform that basically combine all of them together. When you do those operations, you can work by default in global orientation, or you can choose, for example, local, if you want to scale and rotate along the local direction of your object. My favorite way to interact with those transformations is to use the shortcut. In Blender, the shortcut have a main role, and for moving, rotating, and scaling, the shortcuts are G for grab, R for rotating, and S for scaling. So if you just press, for example, G, you start moving this object. And if you want to move along a specific direction, you can press, for example, X for the X-axis, or Y for the Y-axis, or Z for the Z-axis. And then you can just type the value that you want to use. For example, if you can move along the Z by -3 unit. Similar thing for rotation. R, Z, 90 degrees. You are rotating this object of 90 degrees around the Z-axis. All those information about the location, the rotation, and the scale are here on the right panel that by default is closed, but you can open clicking on this small button here. This is the right panel, and by default you should see the location, rotation, and scale of your object. So you can change from them interactively. You can just type the value that you want, or you can just use some mathematical formulas like 1 plus 5 divided by 3 and get directly the result. In the top bar of the viewport we have different menus. This one is, for example, to select the specific mode where you want to operate with the object. By default it's just working in object mode. Then you have some menus for viewport selecting to add new object, or to edit and interact with a selected object. In the top bar we have some options related to the active tool that we are using. So if you change the tool here, you see that you have specific settings and options for that tool. Here in the middle we have more information about how to interact inside the scene. For example, the orientation direction, the pivot point, the snaps, the proportional editing, And here on the right side we have some information related to the viewport. For example, for going from wireframe to solid to material preview or even rendering. In Blender, you can select multiple objects just holding the Shift key, and by default we have the camera, the lamp and the cube. If you want to clean your scene, you can select all of them one by one using the Shift key, or you can just type A for selecting all of them. Then you can press Delete or the X key in order to delete them. If you press X, it's gonna ask you if you want to actually delete them. Let's say OK. Now we can add new object. So when you go to Add, you have several options for the object that you can create, and usually most of the time you want to create mesh object. Some objects have very simple parameters, like the plane for example, and you can see the parameters for the specific object here. This panel that appear in the corner usually show the settings related to the last operation that you did. So as you can see, we have some parameter like, for example, the size or the position of this plane when we edit, but we can change and edit those parameters only when you create your object. Let me make it more clear. If I add, for example, a sphere, UV sphere, we can define the number of segments and of subdivision of the sphere in the different direction. So you can basically choose what's the resolution of your sphere, defining the number of faces that you are using for describing such a sphere. Those parameters can be described only when you create the object, so it's not possible to edit them in a second moment. So make sure that you choose the proper settings when you start, and then after that usually you start manipulating the object in order to create something different. For example, if I now press G because I want to move this object, now I don't have a parameter anymore here, because now I see the parameter for the move operation. So I can change the parameter for the movement if I want to change them a little bit, but I'm not allowed to change anymore the number of subdivision of the sphere. Let's add now a simple primitive like add mesh cylinder. When you create the cylinder, also in this case you have to define the number of vertices that you want. For example, I want to use a cylinder with just 6 vertices. That means that basically is an hexagon extruded. Then we can define the radius or the depth. The unit by default are in meter, so we can set, for example, a depth that is 0.5. Now, if you have created your primitive and you are ready to edit this object, you have to select your object and go from here in the edit mode. Now that we are in edit mode, as you can see, the tools here on the left are different. We have much more option and different tools for interacting with the geometry. We can choose if we want to select the vertices, the edges or the faces that basically are the element that define a generic mesh object. So you can, for example, choose the selection for the faces, and you can select the different faces. If you select just the vertices, you can select directly the point that describes the vertices. You can change this type of selection just typing 1, 2 or 3. Those shortcut allows you to easily change between one selection mode to the other. Let's say that we want to select this face and this face holding Shift key in order to do the multiple selection, and I want to do an inset inside those faces. The inset is basically an offset that creates faces all along the border, creating a more small face in the middle. The inset face is this tool that we have here. So in Blender, those tools work as active tool, so it means that if I'm using the inset face tool, now I'm able to do the same operation several times. Now I already selected 2 faces in the meantime, and if I use this widget here, I can make this inset inside the faces. Once you release, here you have a panel that allows you to change the parameter and define which is the value that you like more. For example, I want to use 0.4. Now that we are done with the inset, I can return to my select box. That is the default tool. You can easily and rapidly go to the select box just typing W. If you continue to press W, it's gonna change the selection tool that you have. Now that we have these two faces selected, I want to create a connection between the top part and the lower part. There are two ways. One way is to press delete in order to delete only the faces that we have selected. If you have a Mac, you can just use the X key and it's gonna behave exactly in the same way. X faces. Now we can, for example, select the edges using 2 for going to edge selection, and we can select pair of edges and connect them just pressing the F key. If you want to see all the operation that you can do in this specific context, you can just press the right button of the mouse and you see that you have a list of tools that works fine with edges. For example, we have the new face from edges, that is F. So from here you can also see what are the shortcuts for the most used tool. So we can use the F for connecting the different parts. This is not, of course, the most efficient way to do such operation. There is actually a much faster way. Let me return back. Before deleting the two faces, we can just press the right button of the mouse. If we are in the face selection, it will show the face context menu, and from here we can bridge faces. The result is the same. In this case it's automatic, but the other way sometimes can help making something more specific according to your need. Now I want to select this face here on the side. I want to select one that is aligned with the x-axis in this case, because this makes more easy to manage the rotation of this face, for example. And I want to do a small extrusion, and we can use the Extrude region tool. We can just press the plus and this is gonna extrude our face. Be careful, because if you press again the plus, it's gonna create new faces, and this may affect the final result of what we want to do. So if you just did some extrusion, just press Ctrl Z for returning back. And make sure that you don't have many extrusion. If you're not sure of what you have done, just return back and try again. So let's do an extrusion of 0.4. Now, with this face selected, I want to return to the select box. So I can type W, and I want to rotate that face. The shortcut for movement, rotation and scale are the same that we have seen in object mode. So if I press R and X, I can rotate this face of 90 degrees. Now I want to repeat the same operation that we have used before, but this time, instead of using the active tool, I want to show you what are the shortcuts. And usually most of the time I use the shortcut because they are quite faster. So let's say that starting from this face I want to extrude it. Don't worry if you see this bad result here, it's gonna be fixed later. So now with this face selected, I can just extrude directly. If you press right button of the mouse, you see that you can extrude faces just pressing E. So if I press the E key, I can extrude this face, for example, of 1.5. Now, as we did before, I want to select these two side faces and make an inset face for those. So I can press, in this case, I. If you press right button of the mouse, you can see that inset faces is I. When you press the right button, you have the context menu, and the content may change according to the selection mode that you're using. But if you want to see directly all the operation that you can do with the faces, you can just go here on faces and see all the options that you can do with faces. Here with edges, vertices, mesh, or UV if you want to do some UV mapping. Here we have these two faces selected, so I want to type I for making an inset of those faces. I want to type 0.4. No, maybe 0.3. And now again I want to bridge these two parts. So same as before, right button of the mouse, bridge faces. Now they are connected. Now we have a very ugly and polygonal geometry, but the power of the mesh modeling software usually is to smooth those geometry quite easily using some algorithm that is called Catmull-Clark. Let's return to object mode. If you go here, you can choose object mode, or because we usually change a lot of time between object mode and edit mode, there is actually a shortcut that is the tab key. If you press tab, you can see that it moves directly from object mode to edit mode. Now that we are in object mode, I want to add a modifier to this object. In Blender, modifiers are really powerful because it allows to create non-destructive workflow for creating complexity starting from something very simple. And for example, we can go here to the wrench icon, the blue wrench icon, modifier properties, and we don't have any modifier yet, but we can click here and add a modifier. The modifier that I want to add is a subdivision surface. You can see that are organized in 4 different categories: modify, generate, deform, and simulate. We want to go to generate, and here we have subdivision surface. And you see now that using this subdivision surface, each face is split into 4 faces, and the vertices are moved in order to change the shape and make it more smooth. The subdivision surface work with consecutive subdivisions, and you can change them using the viewport parameter, and you can increase that value. Don't keep it too high, otherwise everything's gonna be very slow at some point. Now, the nice thing of the modifier is that we can continue to edit our shape having this real-time feedback of what's happening here thanks to the modifier. So if we go to edit mode again, pressing the tab key, you see that you can still see the original polygonal geometry, and we can select, for example, this face, and we can move a little bit if you want to deform. If you press escape, you're gonna stop the movement. Or for example, we can select this edge here and press G, X, and move it in this direction. And sometimes it's a bit tricky to select all the different parts because there is this gap between the polygonal shape and the subdivided one. For that reason, I usually recommend to use this option that projects the cage on the subdivided surface. Now we can manipulate that shape, trying to make it as nice as possible. For example, we can easily select some edges, and we can use the tweak tool if you want to manually change it and find a shape that you like more. The nice thing of this approach to the modeling is that because we are working with inset operation, with bridging, with extrusions, the topology actually have a specific order, and we can use that in order to create some specific effect. For example, let's say that we want to push this part. We can select a loop of faces that represent this piece of the object. For selecting the loops, we can go to face selection, and we can hold the Alt key and click in between these two faces. So I press Alt, I click here, and it automatically selects the entire loop. That means that select all the consecutive faces in that direction. So now I can press G, X, and move in this direction. We can also select a loop of edges. We can go to Edge Selection, hold Alt key, select this one, and with Shift Alt, we can add this loop as well to the selection. And I can now move those loops along the Z direction. G, Z, and I can lift them. I can interact also with the vertices, so I can select this vertex, and with Shift key I can select this one as well. And for example, if I want to move more far apart to each other, I can press the S key, that is basically the scale, and the scale will push them according to the midpoint. Now you see that the object is all subdivided and smooth, and you can define, for example, some part that shouldn't be smooth, just selecting, for example, a loop of edges, Alt, for selecting the entire loop. And in the item panel we have a parameter that is called mean crease. We can increase this value, and you see that when you reach the 1, those loops are gonna be sharp. If you use a lower value, they're gonna be smooth. And you can find a configuration in between in order to tune a little bit the shape of your object. You can do the same with the other loops. For this one as well. Mean crease, you can keep it more sharp. Another property of this object, as we created that, is that if we go to face selection and we select this loop on the side, holding Alt key and clicking here, you see that this loop is actually twisting and going around along this other element in that other direction. We can use this property in order to create some specific effect. So, for example, we can add some cut along this loop using the loop cut tool. When you use the loop cut tool, you can set the number of cuts that you want. So let's say that we want 2 cuts, and when you move your cursor on the geometry, you see that according to the edge that you are pointing with the cursor, it's gonna show a cut along a specific direction. I want to choose this direction, and now I have 2 cuts along this object in this direction. Remember to return to the selection tool, typing W, and now selecting the faces, we can, for example, select this new loop that is inside. We can now, for example, make an extrusion along this entire loop that goes a little bit inside the geometry. So in the Extrude tool, if you hold the left button of the mouse, you can use Extrude along normals. And from here, you can do the extrusion and make this kind of channel along the geometry. Here we have this weird effect because of the crease that we have added before. So we can just select this loop and remove the crease and add again. And now we can return to object mode and see the object that we just created. With this object selected, we can easily create a series of elements just using another modifier that is called array. It's the first one of the generate column, and when you create an array, you can define in which direction you want to create this series of objects. For example, you can set, instead of the X direction, you can type 0 here and disable relative offset and instead use constant offset. Here I want to increase the Z value. The difference is that this one is proportional to the size of the object, this one represents the distance between the two objects. Now we of course have some intersections here, but in edit mode we can edit this object here, selecting those faces. Actually we can select the entire loop and moving on one side. So you see that they are avoiding each other. We can change the distance between the object, we can keep them closer. We can move also this loop here on the top, on the other side, if you want to. Or maybe just this loop of edges. We can set a higher value for the repetition. And we can press right button of the mouse and use Shade Smooth. As you can see, playing with modifiers allows to keep your workflow non-destructive, and you can easily manipulate and generate complexity just with simple repetition rule or other strategies. You can interactively change your object, like selecting this face and move it a little bit. Blender is also nice for visualization, so we can, for example, go to Material Preview, and in the render properties we can activate some ambient occlusion and increase the distance factor, so you can make it a bit more realistic. And we can also play with the material of this object, going here to materials, creating a new material for this object, and this material is the principal shader that allows to create basically most of the material that you can create. So your object can be, for example, metallic, and you can also play with the roughness of its surface in order to affect the reflection quality. You can go here in the viewport shading, interact with some parameter, like activating some background, and you can make nice concept images of your product just right here while you are modeling your object. I hope that you enjoyed this quick introduction about Blender, about its interface and the very basic of mesh modeling. Remember that Blender is free and open source and gives you a lot of power experimenting with shapes and concept ideas about your design. It can be architecture, it can be design in general. See you soon.